and by the members of Channel 6.
Presentation of this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
Moscow. For most of us, the Russian capital is one of the remote, mysterious corners of the world. Distant, unfamiliar, and only since the end of Soviet communism, easily accessible to foreigners. But for some, this is only a point of departure, the beginning of what could be the last great overland journeys in this age of the jet. Yaroslavsky Station. This is where the longest train rides in the world start. No wonder passengers are weighed down like pack mules. They are embarking on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, headed for another continent, for other worlds. And they will be riding the rails for nearly a week. These passengers are boarding a train called the Vostok. That's Orient in Russian, and it is an express. But don't confuse it with the aristocratic Orient Express that carried passengers in luxury from London to Venice. This is a workhorse of a train. It's crowded, it's not very comfortable, and it's slow, chugging along at an average of only 35 miles an hour. There's nothing gracious or elegant about the Vostok, but it takes us to fabled lands that we've heard about since childhood. Until recently, the barriers of international politics kept foreigners out. Now the gates are open, and it's all aboard for the domains of Genghis Khan. There are actually 3 routes on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, 2 Russian, 1 Chinese. One goes from Moscow to Vladivostok, 5,806 miles, 6.5 days, and 8 time zones away. A second goes along the same tracks, but leaves Russia after almost 4,000 miles and swings through Manchuria, down to the Chinese capital of Beijing, a total of 5,626 miles. The Chinese branch starts at Beijing, plods through the Great Wall, and climbs up through the Gobi Desert into the Mongolia of Genghis Khan and Marco Polo. On to Siberia, and the main line tracks and west to Moscow, 4,916 miles. The Beijing-bound Vostok is a rumbling, creaking, clanking time capsule. People are thrown together, not for hours as on a plane, but for days and nights, seemingly without end. Just a break of from 10 to 25 minutes every few hours at some station in the wilderness. To stretch your legs and buy something to snack on, breathe in some good freezing air, and look around. Then it's back on board for humans and others. You don't want your dog to get left behind here. Even Lassie might not find her way home. With a little help from the conductor and some not-so-common courtesy, everybody makes it. The locomotive is electric, a Skoda made in what used to be Czechoslovakia. The system changes to diesel toward the end of the run as the Vostok approaches China. It's no youngster, but the engineers know how to baby it and keep it rattling along. It doesn't have to do much strenuous uphill work. Most of the way it's pretty flat. And where mountains did get in the way of the tracks, the Russians made long detours rather than go to the expense of digging tunnels. Maximum speed? About 100 miles an hour? Maybe, when it was younger. With the Vostok underway again, life on the slow track resumes. A little coal to get the kitchen going. The compartments are only about 6 feet square, with 4 in second class, 2 in what passes for first class on this train. The only way to assure yourself some privacy is to book all the berths in a compartment. Otherwise, you can end up sharing with just about anybody. But just about anybody here seems friendly. Aboard the Vostok this time are a computer expert from Australia and his pal, a security guard from London. They find themselves in a compartment with a South Korean missionary and a scuba diver from Liverpool. Vasily, a Ukrainian businessman, and his wife Oksana are heading for Shenyang in China to try to sell some boats. Russian soldiers on leave, the wife of one of them, and their cat jam into another compartment. Natasha is a little nervous. She is leaving her family and her country to teach Russian in China. Now that we are free to travel, she says, the world is my home. Siberia is my room. Now I am going to another room. In the first-class car, Nadia and Tanya are the provodnitsas, the cabin attendants. They keep their rolling home clean and a motherly eye on their charges. They top up the big samovar with water for tea or coffee and sometimes deliver it personally. A small touch of luxury on a basically do-it-yourself trip. 2 young Germans venture out of their compartment from time to time, but for now, that's their home and they always seem glad to get back to it. A Russian makes it clear to a German tourist that knowing the language isn't necessary. There are universal ways to say, come, share a cigarette or a glass of water.
Half the point of taking a train trip like this is the people you meet. Not so much what you see out the window, but people you would not otherwise come into contact with in your normal day-to-day running, you know.
It's been a fantastic experience.
When somebody that you pass or try to pass in a gangway starts stalking at you and grabs you and drags you to the compartment, you're not quite sure what's happening initially. But yeah, sure, when they start giving you vodka and sausage, and then, okay, it comes apparent, and you can see that it's the hospitality that, as the days go on, you realise is typical of the Russians.
Once-in-a-lifetime experience, isn't it?
What's special about it?
Like everybody else has said, the people you meet.
Russian trains run on Moscow time. The sun can be going down, but the conductor's watch says it's early afternoon. You may find yourself sleeping at noon and lying awake or wandering around at midnight. The first morning aboard the Vostok. A makeshift shower with bucket and enamel cup helps you wake up. There aren't many creature comforts aboard the Vostok, but on this run at least, there's hot water in the 2 bathrooms in each car. There's no observation or club car, so you do your sightseeing through the window. For the true railroad buff, there's always something worth seeing along the tracks and in the marshalling yards. When you start getting bored, there's always one remedy. And on this train, whenever passengers break out the provisions, especially something as tasty as fish caught through the ice and sold at a station platform, they want a friend to share it. Here, where time and space take on new meanings, strangers become old friends quickly. And so what if it's morning here and even an hour earlier in Moscow? Farther east, where this train is heading, it's afternoon and time for a drink. The Vostok is bound for Beijing, so it's no wonder there are a lot of Asians aboard this Russian train. Politically, Russia and China have had their quarrels over the centuries, but on the Trans-Siberian, everyone's a neighbor. The vodka helps make them good neighbors. It may be freezing outside, but there's coal in the furnace and good cheer in the glass. More Westerners are in the dining car now, more Asians, and more vodka. Everyone agrees. More vodka and less blah blah at all those international meetings, and maybe there would be no more wars. The Vostok rolls on. Engine, 2 first-class carriages, and 7 second-class, restaurant and baggage car. There are enormous stretches where it seems God had spread a great white tablecloth over a continent and then, as an afterthought, sprinkled iron rails into a few buildings here and there just for decoration. Still a long way to go before we reach the Ural Mountains where Siberia begins. The journey has barely started. We've gone less than 1,000 miles. But passengers greet every stop, even little Balazino, as a visit to a new world. The young scuba diver from Liverpool comes out in a t-shirt. He has responded to the kindness of Russian fellow passengers by giving one of them his coat. There's always something to look at. Maybe the locals from Russia's great variety of ethnic communities. Maybe just dogs hustling handouts.
What's that?
It's time to stock up for the next leg of the journey. There's a rhythm to all of this. The train brings provisions to the wilderness cities, and the people here in turn supply those who ride the trains. But shopping isn't what's on the mind of the German couple. Long before they're all aboard, they're back in their cozy home away from home. Up front, it's back to eating up the miles, still thousands of them to go. For the engineers, this is just another day at the office. But for those who live east of Moscow, and for those who must cross this vastness the inexpensive way, it's a matter of keeping the lifeline intact. It's cold out here, especially in January. Inside the train, there's bottled heat and there's coal. Sometimes the cabin attendants forget to raise or lower the fire, and it becomes a little chilly or stuffy. Adding a sweater or taking one off will help. You watch as the scattered communities go by in a blur. With their wooden houses and unpaved streets, they look like something out of the old American West. The Vostok has been rolling along for 24 hours now, and we are approaching Perm, the last major stop before the Urals and Siberia. Many passengers don't even ask where they are. By now, this is just another backcountry station. But it is a chance for a cigarette. On board, smoking is permitted only around the doors between carriages, and it gets cold and windy there with the train moving through the night.
Нормально. Приехали пассажиры.
She's a sturdy old girl, and the Vostok doesn't need much roadside maintenance. A couple of knocks here and there, gets some of the ice off. Everything sounds all right, so once again, it's all aboard and eastward ho. A midnight snack, whatever the time here is, and for some it's always party time. We finally cross the Urals, even if we can't see them in the dark, and now the sounds of the train in the Siberian night become a lullaby. Siberia, Sibir, the sleeping land. The hundreds of thousands of exiles and political prisoners who were sent here on foot and shackled by the czars and the communists had some harsher names. For the writer, Maxim Gorky, it was the land of chains and ice. Larger than China, larger than the United States and Europe put together. Enormous, but lonely. 3/4 of Russia's territory, little more than 1/5 of its population. 10 to 15 people per square mile. You travel through it in a daze, suspended in time. The swaying of the train, its groans and moans and grumbles that lull you to sleep and startle you awake, the blur of the endless countryside. The taiga, Siberia's woods of larch and pine, the biggest forest in the world, big enough to cover the continental United States, 1/4 of the entire world's timber reserves. And dwelling in these woods, the animals whose fur was a lure for the opening of Siberia. There's great wealth below the frozen surface, too. Gold and diamonds to rival the bounty of South Africa, antimony and tungsten. Perhaps 1/3 of the world's coal. Oil and gas in the kind of quantities to be found in the Arabian Gulf. It's the job of the Trans-Siberian to bring this wealth to Moscow and the rest of the world. For the passengers, perhaps, a train passing through this world of white is just another train. They rarely give a thought to what it took to build the Trans-Siberian. Japan and China are a lot closer to eastern Siberia than Moscow is, and toward the end of the 19th century, those countries made no secret of their desire to take over the territory. The czars knew they had to do something to protect the growing Russian population and Siberia's natural resources. How could they get troops and new settlers into the area quickly? The idea of laying tracks across this wilderness seemed just too overwhelming. Russia couldn't do it. Nobody could do it. But there was no other way. Russia had to do it. Work began in 1891. One of the most gigantic construction jobs of modern times was underway. Soldiers and convicts, exiles and foreign laborers using hand tools began hacking through 2 continents. It was a task that would make digging the Panama Canal 13 years later seem like child's play. The canal is 51 miles long. This railroad was to link Moscow with Vladivostok on the Pacific, a distance of nearly 6,000 miles. Siberia already was known as the land of frozen corpses. Now, as workers, desperate or doomed enough to take on the job, struggled through mud and ice and snow, were attacked by bandits and smothered by landslides, it became even more so. Work proceeded on 6 sections at the same time, from the west and from the east. By 1898, they had gone more than halfway, as far as Lake Baikal. Getting across was another matter. First, icebreakers and ferries were used. And passengers resumed the journey on sections of the line being built west from Vladivostok. War between Russia and Japan in 1904 made it urgent to get troops across the lake faster. The Russians used horses to pull trains over the ice, while they hurried to lay tracks around the southern end. Construction dragged on after this war. Floods, disease, even man-eating tigers kept getting in the way. It took another war, World War I, to make finishing the job a top priority. In 1916, the last gap was filled, the last tracks laid. The Trans-Siberian Railroad, a highway of steel, linked Europe with the Pacific. Now it's hard to imagine Siberia without this railroad. Satellites, telecommunications, jet planes may have changed other parts of the world, but Siberia is still the great sleeping land. There isn't much traffic to wake it up, and very few roads for what cars there are. The tracks are Siberia's freeway. It's not just these continent-gulping expresses that make up the Trans-Siberian. There are a host of short haulers and freight trains and tankers. And Siberia's small population, still in this immensity, only about 3 times as big as that of metropolitan Moscow, lives for the most part in clusters of primitive homes alongside the tracks. Places where people who built the railroad settled and those who keep it running live now. Few, if any, paved roads, hardly a store, except for a few cars they could have come straight from another age.
Вы давно на дороге работаете?
Ну, уже сколько, 2 года.
И как вам дорога тут? Работается на
A
дороге?
railroad worker called Sasha says things have changed, but for the worse. The transition from communism to the free market system has been painful, he says. Everything is expensive, and we don't have the security we used to.
Работает 11 человек, вы сами поймите, какой.
But there's another Siberia that's a lot more like middle-class America, with its upwardly mobile young couples, country houses, and barbecues. People with small businesses, connections with foreign companies, importers and exporters. These are people who are making it in the new capitalist jungle. Like us, they're proud of how far they've come, but worried about the future. Our generation, one man says, has it easier than those who came before us. They only knew hard work. In the old days, they say, you could afford a TV or stereo, but there weren't any. Now everything's available, but it's up to you. You have to make the money.
Мне сейчас занимаются эти времена, потому что наше государство всех бабушек и дедушек, всех пенсионеров.
Maybe someone else says it was tough in communist times, but at least people knew what to expect. Our parents worked hard all their lives, saved their 1,000 rubles and knew their children could bury them. Who can afford to bury them now? Ask any Russian and he'll tell you the old days were better.
Сейчас, пожалуйста, у тебя все, что хочешь, можешь купить, только ты зарабатывай. Все зависит сейчас от тебя. А тогда мы все зависели от государства. Ну как, ну вот начинаем вспоминать, вот раньше все-таки было вообще. Там деды, отцы там жили, там все, да? Деньги.
Where they used to yearn for prosperity and freedom, now they ask for stability, a future without nasty surprises.
Я работаю, меня никто не выгонит, у меня хоть какие-то были права. У меня сейчас одни обязанности.
А самое главное, Ира, ты знала, что ты ее получишь вовремя.
20
Нет,
лет в своей квартире.
Ты еще хочешь, чтобы
40,
за твою работу платили столько,
получается. Сколько ты заработал, правильно?
Девушки, о чем мечтаете?
Мы...
They do agree, however, it's nice to know we have the freedom to get on that train out there, if we have the price of a ticket. A lot of people died building this line, and it isn't easy to keep the trains running through the long Siberian winter. But Russia has no choice. In some other countries, the automobile and the truck crowd the landscape, and the role of the railroads has been reduced. In others, new bullet or TGV trains are making rail travel faster than ever. But here, the Vostok and her sisters just keep plodding along. A thoughtful traveler, seeing how few people live here, might ask if perhaps there's a downside to this great railroad. Foreign loggers are here already, wantonly clear-cutting the timber, and one wonders what scars Russia's new free market system will make on the face of a seemingly eternal nature reserve by the time this boy becomes a man. The food supply out here varies, but on this trip, the station at Ishim turns out to be a good place for breakfast.
Ничего, ну хватит, все уже.
Во сколько?
Что? Пирожков берите горяченький.
Колбаска, пирожки.
1000. Фотографировать.
И ешь.
Колбаска, пирожки.
1000.
Возьмем пирожок?
Возьмем. О.
Somehow, bananas have gotten here all the way from South America. A small miracle on a very long supply line.
Вот нашли яз.
And aboard, something you see rarely on this long journey. Someone actually comes along with drinks and biscuits for sale. There's no urgency to sell these things. The restaurant car staff has brought a big supply of sweets and liquor and cigarettes and knows it will get a good price for whatever is left at the last Russian town before the border. It's an unofficial function of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the trains that cast their shadow over two continents. It may look pretty dull through a foggy window, but there's a lot of history out there. Omsk was the headquarters of the Siberian Cossacks until the late 19th century. Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, was exiled here and served 4 years of hard labor for suggesting the Tsars ease up on their repression. Just to the south and to the east of Omsk is Kazakhstan, formerly part of the Soviet Union, and this is where the Christian and Muslim worlds meet. But for those who are going on, deeper into the world of Siberia, it's time to get moving again. The Russian soldiers invite us into their compartment. They're friendly enough, and as usual, friendship is sealed with vodka.
Дружба между американским и советским, российским народом была крепкой, надежной и нерушимой.
Окей, выпили, а я переведу потом.
Cheers, cheers. Did you all meet on this train?
Cheers.
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 На здоровье.
So it was for
здоровье, на
friendship
здоровье.
between Russians and Americans. And,
Good.
Anyway, you see.
Good.
На здоровье.
На здоровье. But it seems that long after the Cold War, there are those in the Russian military who are suspicious of their old American enemies. This soldier, apparently an intelligence officer, takes our picture and demands to know how Americans really feel about Russia. Have you lost your respect for us because of the breakup of the Soviet Union? His comrades are embarrassed.
Так тоже думаю, что не делается, все к лучшему. Все равно.
Что?
Я тоже думаю, что все, что не делается сейчас у нас, все идет, мне кажется, к лучшему.
I think that everything that is going on in our country is going towards the better.
Are there dangers, troubles, problems?
Там есть опасности, какие-то проблемы.
Проблемы, они всегда есть. Без
Well,
проблем
of course, there are always
жизни
problems.
нет.
There's no life without problems.
Yes. Right. Second class, it's also time for a little music that has done its share of border crossing.
knocking on heaven's door.
Let's break our journey for a moment to see what the Trans-Siberian and its passengers look like on the return trip from China. This is Novosibirsk, the biggest city in Siberia. Population 1.5 million. 2,000 miles and 3 time zones from Moscow. These people don't live in Siberia, they live off of it. Throughout history, Siberia has been on the trade route between China and the West. It used to be caravans taking furs and hides out, bringing tea, silk, spices, and porcelain through. Now it's pretty much a one-way trade route, with the iron horse replacing the camel. Chinese merchants bring in big cargoes. Others smuggle in bundles of shirts and jackets and jeans and women's underwear. They're better than the Russian-made goods that are available out here where the supply line is stretched thin. Another 500 miles up the line is Krasnoyarsk. Not so long ago, foreigners were barred from this area because the Soviet Union kept nuclear weapons and a reactor here. One underground complex was said to be 10 times longer than the Moscow subway. Now there is no Soviet Union, and Russia doesn't care who gets off the train. All you would be likely to see if you explored Krasnoyarsk today would be factories making things like television sets and audio cassettes. Misha the cook takes a rare break from the kitchen to watch others work. It's the kind of work you rarely see Western conductors do. We have gone more than 3,000 miles now, and at last the landscape is changing. The mountains are before us, sweeping east to the Pacific and south into Mongolia and China. An even greater spectacle lies beyond that tunnel.
Сказали минут через 50.
Через час.
Those who know start watching for it. Lake Baikal. At first, just a glimpse. Now, here it is. 88 hours on the train, and it's worth the journey. That's no field the kids are on. It's the frozen pearl of Siberia, perhaps the most beautiful place in all of Russia. There, with rustic villages hugging its shore, is the magnificent Baikal. The deepest lake in the world, more than a mile down, born when the Earth's crust ruptured 30 million years ago, and bigger than Belgium. 1/5 of all the fresh water on the Earth's surface is here. The way to really see it is to get off the train at Irkutsk. An hour and a half to the east by road, and you're at the lake. It's not Baikal's enormity that stuns you. It's the tranquil beauty. "336 rivers and streams flow into Lake Baikal. Only one flows out, the Angara River." They may be poor, but what a playground for the children. And if many of the houses don't have drinking water, that's no problem for these hardy Siberian youngsters. Where in the world can you find purer water than this? In one of the villages on the shore, an old man sits outside his cottage and enjoys the day, the lake, and life. He's an artist named Panov, who was sent into exile in Siberia by Stalin. With his words, he gives gastronomic advice. Simple food, he says, is better than civilized food. I eat frozen fish. It goes well with vodka. You always eat with vodka. With vodka, this fish is better than oysters. It's from the Baikal. He gives a different kind of advice with his art. When the repression ended and democracy came to Siberia, Panov says, at last I was free to express myself. His wood carvings show Stalin and other communist leaders trampling the people and their religion. We must remember what we had, says Panov, and appreciate what we have now. This is his answer to those in his country who claim that the old days were better. Shari Shuri From the frozen lake, the sparkling Angara River flows northwest to Irkutsk. It's an old garrison town and trading center, but it took aristocratic and rebellious 19th century exiles from Russia and Poland to turn it into the city people call the heart and soul of Siberia. 650,000 people live here now. The graceful old wooden houses still stand. So too do the more ornate homes of wealthy merchants and those who struck it rich when gold was discovered near here. Many of Irkutsk's Russian Orthodox and Catholic churches were converted under communism into party and public buildings, but some survived. This was a city of noblemen and nouveau riche, of professionals and educators. Communism made it a military-industrial center. That industry has collapsed. There are beggars now and hosts of unemployed. But Irkutsk maintains its old mix of wilderness and civilization. It remains an elegant city, not much like the image most foreigners have of Siberia. And people still enjoy the simple pleasures of living in one of nature's last paradises. A stroll along the river, huddling for warmth under a plastic cover, waiting for the fish to bite. Showing the kids how it's done.
Конечно.
Ну, а то так ты не увидишь, ты снегу видишь.
Watching the sun go down on the Angara. A harsh land? Sometimes. But Siberians, almost by definition, are survivors. And because the railroad has made it more of a trading hub than ever, Irkutsk doesn't suffer the shortages that still plague many Russian communities. You're not always going to find real flowers here, but just about everything else is available for a high price. Nature is a major provider. There are probably hundreds of different varieties of fish in Lake Baikal. Furs here are no luxury. They have been a staple of Siberia's economy and kept its people warm for centuries. With all the sable and fox and mink in this area, no one worries much about the species dying out. There are times, though, even here, when something a little lighter is required. Financial problems of the post-communist era have wounded Irkutsk's cultural heritage. but have far from killed it. Theaters still draw crowds, and the crowds are as sophisticated as ever. This surprising city, literally in the middle of Siberia, has managed to hold on to the spirit of its past as it struggles into an uncertain future. Irkutsk is worth the stopover, but it's time to get back on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. At night, some who have dozed throughout the day make their way to the restaurant car. It's more than hunger that brings us here. It's the need to be with others. The two Ludmilas who work in the kitchen are here too, for the communal breaking of bread. For the lifting of glasses that is so much a part of Russian life. It's hardly gourmet fare on the Vostok, and even the solyanka, a tangy soup made with lemon, sausage, olives, a dollop of sour cream, and who knows what else, wears thin after a few days. But everyone digs in. Vasily and Oksana demonstrate Ukrainian drinking techniques to an American writer. In Moscow, Vasily says, it is 5 p.m. Here it is 8 o'clock. God is not confused. He has decided it is the right time for us to meet and become friends. Brava is right. Left. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Попробуй. Не, вот так. Лево, ладно, хорошо. Смотри. Вот, смотри, так сделай. Хоп. Попробуй.
Then it's showtime. Ivan and his magic spoon.
Не, смотри, вот. No. Вот, смотри, вот.
Natasha begins to forget her worries about leaving home. It's a moment out of time and space. A moment to vow eternal friendship with people you will never see again. After the ball is over, the two Ludmilas linger as the Vostok rocks through the night to sing one last song and recall other nights, other journeys, and perhaps the love of other times.
хватит мне на мой век своего, а мне счастья чужого не хочется.
It's still Russia, still Siberia, but once you leave Irkutsk and swing past the southern tip of Lake Baikal, you are in a very different world. This is the land of the Buryat Mongols. It was near here that Genghis Khan was born and began the conquest of what became the largest nation the medieval and modern worlds have known. His descendants on this side of Russia's border with Mongolia have clung to their own language, their religion, some of the old ways. These are heading home, and they love it. The Buryat capital is Ulan-Ude. It means the Red Uda River. Because it is so near the Mongolian border, it was a closed military city under Soviet rule. Now, it's open to the world. The Vostok, on this run from Moscow to Beijing, has brought us, so far, 3,507 miles. We are at the place where the Russian bear gives way to the horsemen of Mongolia and the dragons of China. The lands of Genghis Khan and Marco Polo. Here in Ulan-Ude, we feel the beat of the wild heart of Central Asia. We are near the Mongolian border, and the Vostok is taking us ever deeper into Buryat Mongol country. The Buryats may be separated from their kinsmen by a line in the snow, but neither the Tsars of Russia nor the commissars of communism were able to strip them of their traditions, to take from them their language, their ways, their religion. Stalin sent thousands of lamas, the Buddhist priests, to Siberia's gulags and destroyed most of the monasteries. but one survived near Ulan-Ude, and once again, people come to worship in the old way. The old way here is a strict form of Tibetan Buddhism called Yellow Hat. They marry here and spin their own kind of wheel of fortune. Those who marry are taught that a husband must minister to his wife with respect, courtesy, faithfulness, and by handing over authority and adorning her. The wife shows her love by hospitality to relatives, faithfulness, protecting the goods her husband brings, and by skill and industry in her endeavors. All express their devotion directly to Buddha. For the message to get there, the prayer wheels must be spun clockwise. As in times past, worshippers also write their prayers on slips of paper and leave them out in the open for the winds to take and the gods to see. And like their relatives across the border, they now are free to recall openly and with pride the founder of the great Mongol nation, a man whose memory the communists tried to destroy. It was not far from here that in the year 1167, the wife of a Mongol chieftain gave birth to a boy who was named Temujin, but came to be called Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Genghis Khan, with his hordes of Buryat and other Mongols, conquered half of the known world. His sons and grandsons stretched that empire from Korea to Hungary. From Ulan-Ude, the Vostok does not take us south into Mongolia. That will come later in our journey. Now we are heading east for lands that the Mongols conquered. We are bound for China. We cross still another time zone. It's Moscow time plus 6 hours. For those who have not stopped along the way, it is day 5 of this journey toward infinity. We are in a vast, almost empty world, a wilderness breached by power lines and railroad tracks, but with few places you could call cities or even towns, and judging by what we see from our windows, few living creatures. Some passengers are excited by the prospect of leaving the world's biggest country, Russia, and entering the 3rd largest, China. Canada ranks between them. Some are just glad to be going home. At last, the Russia that seemed so endless ends in a miserable little border town called Zabaikalsk. Hardly the place one would choose to spend 4 hours hanging around a dingy railroad station.
Okay.
This is checking out, and so it's okay. It's a normal situation, man. No problem.
It's not the passport checking or the customs inspection that causes the delay.
Вот даже.
What happens now is a throwback to the fear and mistrust that Russia had for its neighbors for centuries, often with good reason. Fear and mistrust that so often in the past prompted this giant country to be an aggressor rather than risk being the possible victim of aggression. It's an operation railroad buffs rarely get to see because it's usually not necessary. The changing of the wheel assemblies, bogies they call them. Russia, fearing invasion by train, built its railroads wider than those of its neighbors and of the rest of the world. Now, for the Vostok to move on to the Chinese tracks, it must shed its 5 feet wide bogies and settle back on the smaller standard gauge assemblies. There's not much to do in the gloomy waiting rooms. No duty-free shops here at the frayed end of Russia's supply line. Not much of anything to look at or buy. It's hardly worthwhile looking for the station restaurant, for there's little to eat there. This is the town where the Vostok's dining car crew will sell the extra goodies it brought from Moscow. The crew and the dining car itself end their journey here, and Zabaikalsk needs anything it can get. For the bored and weary passengers, it's a time of transition between the aggressive, pioneer spirit of Russia and the ceremonial, age-old traditions of China. A time, perhaps, to contemplate a transition in one's own life, the crossing of a personal border between past and future. Natasha, on the verge of entering a new and, for her, somewhat frightening world, is a little nervous. At last, it's all aboard. The slow train to China on its new wheels is set to roll again. But not for long. In a few minutes, we will stop again for a couple of hours on the Chinese side for baggage and passport control. It's about 3 in the morning when the Vostok finally gets going again, but for many, it's no time for sleeping. Chinese-Russian relations always are a bit uneasy, and the Chinese passengers are happy to be back on their turf, enjoying their kind of food in the Chinese dining car that has replaced the Russian car. Now it's the turn of Russians and Westerners to enter someone else's territory, and for the South Korean pastor to mix with normally hostile North Koreans who are heading back to their home. On the peace train called the Vostok, that's no problem. Language isn't a problem either, as voices are raised in the songs of several nations. The Asian women do not take part. The men don't seem to mind. There's more food on this Chinese dining car. It's chopsticks now for eating and making music. You Russians think you know how to dance? Watch how we Chinese do it. A Russian joyously takes up the challenge. The Russian spirit is still alive and well on the Vostok as it plunges into China. When day breaks, we at last can see something of China, and a rather somber look it is. Ever since crossing the border, we have been in a land with a mystical name and a glorious past, Manchuria. home of the fierce Manchus. Marco Polo, in the book of his travels, called it Chorcha. He described it as a far-stretching plain with no cities or towns, a tributary state of the legendary Christian prince, Prester John. In 1644, the Manchus breached the Great Wall and conquered China. The Manchus established the Qing dynasty that ruled China until 1912. Manchuria, through the ages, has been a disputed land. Russia and China and Japan have fought for it. At one point, the Russians were permitted to build a railroad across Manchuria to their naval base at Port Arthur. But the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 put an end to Russia's domination of northeast China. The Japanese controlled Manchuria until the end of World War II. After the war, the Soviets rolled in, plundered Manchuria, and armed and protected an underground Chinese communist army that eventually took it over. Now Manchuria is just another part of China. As far as the Chinese are concerned, it doesn't even have its old name. The Chinese, in their more romantic moments, call it the land of the Black Dragon River. Officially, it's just Dongbei, literally east-north. You look from the windows of the Vostok and wonder where the grandeur of the Manchus has gone. The guidebooks call this a fruited plain. The Chinese government boasts of Manchuria's development as an industrial powerhouse. What we see in winter is poor villages, dried stalks of corn and wheat piled up for cooking and heating. Overcrowded cities where either side of the tracks is the wrong side. The official tour guides in this communist country might steer you away from sites like these, but tourists and the money they bring are welcome, and apparently no one worries about what you see from the train. When the Vostok stops, there's a not-so-subtle reminder that the camaraderie of Chinese and Russian passengers aboard the train is not generally shared by their countries. The norm on any railroad is to lock the toilets while trains are at the station to keep the tracks there undefiled. As soon as the Vostok crossed the border, the attendants forgot about that sanitary precaution. But then As day turns into night, we begin to see a different China. The China we imagined when we heard the whistle of trains passing through our childhood. Back in the great social hall of the Vostok, the dining car, it's Chinese beer now instead of Russian vodka. And time to tackle the chopsticks. It looks so easy. We have reached the industrial city of Shenyang, and here the Ukrainian couple, Vasily and Oksana, get off to see if the Chinese will buy the boats their factory is building. They bid farewell to people who were strangers a week ago, but in the forced intimacy of the Vostok have become friends, even without knowing each other's language. This is the 7th and last night aboard the Vostok, little more than 500 miles to Beijing. We will be there early in the morning. At last, Beijing. The Russians still refer to it by its old name, Peking. 5,626 miles from Moscow. The Vostok made it in a little over 6 days. For some of us, it seemed more like 6 weeks. Others were sorry to leave what had become a home away from home, but were eager to continue the adventure by whatever means. Someone has taken pity on the young Brit who gave away his coat in Siberia and lent him one, but just until he can get a roof over his head. We are venturing out into a city that is the showcase of a nation of contrasts and contradictions. A nation that, despite central planning, developed the world's fastest growing economy, where the free market has been officially caged but has sprouted 1,000 wings, where 2/3 of the urban workforce is employed by more than 100,000 state-run companies, but somehow private enterprise, quietly nursed by need and Chinese business acumen, has steadily grown in the rubble of communist dogma. This is a city of 10 million. Enough to fill other entire countries, but a drop in the bucket for China. This country has a total of well over 1.2 billion people, 1/5 of the world's population. As crowded as Beijing and the other big cities of China are, 7 of every 10 Chinese still live in the countryside, where the promise of prosperity seems as remote as ever. We soon will find that the progress we see in the capital and the rich coastal areas rarely is to be found in the inland provinces. And even if predictions that the growth rate of China's economy will overtake that of the United States within a generation are correct, the average Chinese citizen seems certain to remain much poorer than the average American. Here we find a pulsing city of skyscrapers and luxurious hotels. Of bright lights and red lanterns. In Tiananmen Square, the gate of heavenly peace, where thousands of protesters were killed by Chinese troops in 1989, kites, not bullets, fill the air. Mao Zedong, the father of communist China, gazes benignly down at his people and at the foreigners he wouldn't have permitted in his lifetime and whose investments have made China one of the world's largest exporters of manufactured goods. Now, like the Forbidden City, home and court of the emperors, which was off limits even to ordinary Chinese for 500 years, China itself has opened its doors. There are places the Chinese want tourists to visit, like this one north of Beijing, where we walk the Soul Path, guarded by stone figures that leads to the tombs of the Ming emperors. From here, we see the mountains that, like scenes from scroll paintings, symbolize the eternal China. And what symbolizes China more than the Great Wall? Actually, it's a series of walls that were built to protect individual kingdoms. They were linked 2,000 years ago in an attempt to keep invaders like the Manchus and the Mongols out of China. 300,000 people worked at it and constructed a barrier nearly 1,500 miles long. Impressive, but not very successful. Genghis Khan supposedly commented that the strength of a wall depends on the courage of those who defend it, and proceeded to send his horsemen right on through. Today, the invaders are hordes of tourists, including some of our fellow passengers. It's cold up here, but that doesn't seem to bother our British friend. There is another China few foreigners get to see, and this offshoot of the Trans-Siberian Railroad takes us time and again through sections of the Great Wall and puts us right into it. The Trans-Mongolian line goes from Beijing to the Mongolian capital of Ulaanbaatar, then north to Ulan-Ude, west to Irkutsk, and on to Moscow. About 5,000 miles. Royal messengers used to make this journey strapped to their horses and going full tilt in some 40 days. The Chinese train does it in 5.5 days, taking a shorter route than the Russian line through Manchuria. This is no empty land like Siberia, and as we travel first west and then north toward Mongolia, we see a prettier, more fertile landscape than we did in Manchuria. The Chinese trains on this run aren't luxurious, but they are a bit more comfortable than the Russians. There's supposedly no such thing as classes in China's communist society, but there are different categories on the trains. So-called soft and hard seat carriages, and the soft ones cost twice as much as the hard ones. An easier trip than aboard the Vostok and other Russian trains? Yes, but not nearly as much fun. The Beijing-Moscow long hauler is by no means the only train on this route. There are enough others that passengers can easily debark for a day or two and then move on again. We are cutting through the mountains along the route of the caravans that carry tea and spices, silk and porcelain on the long road to Europe. We have gone less than 250 miles in the 8 hours since we left Beijing, but it's time to break our journey. Datong is a city steeped in history, smothered in coal dust, and flooded with people. 90% of the Chinese population lives in the eastern fifth of the country. At rush hour, you would think most of them are right here. And what if they all drove cars instead of bicycles? Some still wear the old Mao costume, But most, even here in the provinces, have taken to Western garb. The bright clothes and the piles of fruit fill the city with color. Horns and motorbikes fill it with noise. The Yungang is a decent, though far from luxurious, hotel. And right across the street, some excellent restaurants. Talk about Peking duck. This is as good as any you would find in the capital. In a country where travelers would be well advised to bring their own bowls and chopsticks to most ordinary eating places, these are unusually clean. Driving through the outskirts, we were startled by the sight of marching troops. But those weren't rifles they were carrying. This was a cleanup detail. Only 10 miles from Datong are the 53 temple caves of Yungang, a treasure house of Buddhist art. Carved into the side of Mount Wuzu 1,500 years ago, they hold 51,000 statues. This immense undertaking was an act of conciliation by rulers of the North, repentance for having persecuted the Buddhists. The figures are of all sizes. The biggest, 56 feet tall. We were heading southeast of Datong, tracing the caravan route, and were in for another surprise. Where the camel drivers and the camels took refuge, villages sprang up. And as we examined this caravanserai, we found that we in turn were being examined by the villagers, especially the youngsters. It seemed they never had seen Westerners before. When Chinese encountered Portuguese adventurers centuries ago, they called them long noses. That became a term for foreigner. The kids and their parents thought this group of long noses great fun. Where, we wondered, were the inscrutable Chinese, supposedly so suspicious of foreigners? Farther on, we hear the sound of drums. Then, hopping out onto the highway from a village road, comes a procession. This is no folklore show for tourists. This is the traditional China that Mao's Cultural Revolution tried in vain to kill. The occasion? Celebration of the first full moon after the Chinese New Year. Villagers entertain their neighbors first and then wander off to share their joy with others. We are as strange a sight to them as they to us. We each pause to enjoy the spectacle. Then they make their way across the fields toward the next village. We keep going too, and soon find ourselves not just in another place, but seemingly in another age. Unlike the hardy souls who ride the Trans-Siberian, most visitors come to China by plane, and if they travel here at all, they go by air from one metropolis to another. They conclude that this is a country that blends the well-being of today with the splendors of the past. Here we find little that is modern, less that is splendid. It's the way people lived 1,000 years ago, and in this country, it's not that unusual. 35 million Chinese still make their homes in caves like these. Here in the great dry gorge known as the Valley of the Lings, people live off a harsh land. You could call this terrace farming with a vengeance. Even here, though, everyone is reasonably well dressed. One wonders how far they have to go to get their clothing and other necessities. And how do they get there? Well, there are buses. And these people are used to walking great distances. One way or the other, we soon realize they make it to Hunyuan, the county seat. 35 miles from Datong, not much more than 200 from the skyscrapers of Beijing. This may be the big city for people who live on the side of the mountain, but Hunyuan is a pretty grim place. There are more people and a lot more filth. There's a restaurant, but not much in the way of indoor plumbing in Hunyuan. The local market is a safer bet. Another 3 miles, still another world. Hengshan, one of the 5 sacred mountains of China, and the Hanging Monastery. Supported by poles and backed against an enormous rock, it stands ignored and decaying, a glory of its past that China has all but forgotten. This is a long way off the tourist trail. It seems the officially atheistic Chinese government has little interest in a Buddhist monument that few visitors spend money to see. Datong was the last place in the world to manufacture steam engines, 240 of them a year. Some of these old-timers are still in service. But the Trans-Mongolian is diesel. Back aboard and eager to reach one of the world's more remote outposts, legendary Mongolia. We must pass through what is called Inner Mongolia. This is a part of China, and in appearance, character, and even people, it is far more Chinese than Mongolian. For the Chinese, this was a buffer between themselves and a supposedly independent Mongolia, which was a vassal of the Soviet Union. To keep it under their control, they loaded the population to the point where nowadays only 1 in every 10 persons is Mongolian. Eventually, we get by the ugly cities and reach the southern fringes of the Gobi Desert. It doesn't look like a desert. It's a sea of grass and rocks. Buried somewhere out here is the summer capital of Genghis Khan's grandson. The Chinese know it as Chengdu. The poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, saw it in a drugged vision. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. A miracle of rare device, Coleridge called it, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Chengdu or Xanadu, it's long gone. But as we cross the Gobi Desert, we feel a sense of the loneliness and the strength of the Mongolia which the world once feared and now barely remembers. By the time day breaks, we have crossed the border and are deep inside Mongolia. This is one of the most sparsely inhabited countries in the world. 4 persons per square mile. No wonder we see more animals than people. Ulaanbaatar, Red Hero, the Mongolian capital. If we hadn't stopped at Datong, it would have taken only a day and a half from Beijing. But what a difference. Here we see what 70 years of communist regimentation did to a nation of nomads. The communists turned a religious center that was little more than a village into a sprawling city of industry and ugly apartment buildings. They herded people here from the deserts and the mountains until 1 of every 4 Mongolians became a city dweller. There was no way to house them all, and so the gers, the nomads' movable tents, became part of a new urban landscape. But the nomadic instinct does not die. Now, after so many years of being caught between what they consider the Chinese devil and the deep Red Sea of Soviet communism, the Mongolians find themselves free at last, but caught in the squeeze between economic systems. The end of subsidized industry closed factories and cost 1 out of 6 people in the capital their jobs. There's little in the way of food and consumer goods. Youths with too little hope and too much vodka roam the streets and steal to survive. But starting just beyond the city limits, there is another Mongolia. The old Mongolia of people as tough as they are proud, of people born to ride, to live on and with the land that once was the heart of an empire. Out here, wealth is counted by the number of sheep a family has. Barter often takes the place of money. Genghis Khan once took refuge in these mountains from those who would kill him. The Soviets tried to force the Mongolians to forget about the father of their country. After all, the mighty Russians were among his conquests. Now, his memory is invoked, not just as a great leader of the past, but as the spirit of Mongolia's future, and the mountains are called with pride the Genghis Khan Range. Here, people live as they lived long before communism came and went. They move with their animals from one slope to another with the changing of the seasons. Only 30-odd miles from the capital, but there are few roads out here. Frozen rivers take their place. One road of ice brought us to a nomad encampment. Here we found the Mongolia that was, is, and it would seem will be for a long time to come. It is the tradition in Mongolia to welcome travelers, foreigners though they may be, to offer tea laced with mare's milk and salt. We could not speak with each other, but we needed no words. There was something here that made us understand that from one end of the earth to another, we are more alike than different. As we left the Gare, our guide cautioned us not to commit the Western sin of offering a tip. People outside the cities would be offended. Soon we would be on the train again, heading north to Siberia, where we would rejoin the main Trans-Siberian line that would take us back to the Russian capital. We had crossed Siberia and visited the incomparable Lake Baikal. We had seen the ancient splendors of China. We had reached the land of Genghis Khan. In the restless days of youth, as the old song says, we longed to see those faraway places with the strange-sounding names. Now at last, we have.
Funding for this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
To order a video cassette of Trans-Siberian Rail Journeys, call PBS Video at 1-800-828-4PBS or write to the address on the screen.
Presentation of this program is made possible locally by Caboose Hobbies. Whether a serious collector or casual hobbyist, Caboose Hobbies has something for everyone, offering a huge selection of trains, videos, historic railroad books, and much, much more. And by the members of Channel 6.
What does it mean to be Native American? It means to be proud, to know that our past and our beginning and our history is a whole circle of life.
Thursday at 7.
Educational programming on Channel 6 is made possible in part by a grant from the Henry H. and Emma Krauss McVeigh Educational Fund.
Next on Mystery.
You're not trying to tell us that this is all a practical joke.
No, madame, not a joke. But a trick most deadly.
My share of my father's estate is mine, absolutely. I shall not part with one penny of it.
Have you still really no idea who could have done this awful murder?
I got more idea who didn't do it. He was killed by his own flesh and blood.
Hercule Poirot's Christmas on Mystery.
Mystery, Thursday at 8.
Business News Brief is funded locally by the law firm of Moy, Giles, O'Keefe, Vermeer, and Gorell, growing with Colorado, and by the members of Channel 6.
I'm Paul Kangas. This news brief. The nation's trade deficit had an unexpected 10% increase to $11.3 billion in September as exports fell and imports of costly oil rose. That disappointing report failed to deter the buying binge on Wall Street as the Dow Industrial Average jumped over the 6,400 level for the first time ever with a closing gain of nearly 32.5 points, its 10th record high of the last 11 trading sessions and its 40th of the year. The NASDAQ index closed up 2 1/3 points while the American Exchange Index gained 2 1/2 points. Thanks to strong demand for the Treasury's 5-year note auction today, the 30-year Treasury bond rose 11/30 seconds, cutting the yield to 6.41%. And tomorrow we'll talk with Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Alice Rivlin about where the economy is headed. For more financial news, tune into the Nightly Business Report weekdays on this public television station.
It's time to board the Britcom bus for the British Comedy Network on Channel 6. Attention, loyal subjects. If you love the British comedies shown only here on Channel 6, board the Britcom bus and become a part of the new British Comedy Network. Call the Britcom